You bullies rip the student's jacket in the hallway, then regret everything Kieran Thorne had perfected the art of invisibility. At 5'6", with a wiry frame that seemed to fold in on itself whenever he walked, he moved through the halls of Roosevelt High School like a shadow. His dark hair fell across his forehead in uneven waves, partially obscuring brown eyes that held more depth than anyone bothered to notice. The oversized navy jacket he wore belonged to his older brother, a hand-me-down that hung loose on his narrow shoulders and made him appear even smaller than he already was. 3 weeks had passed since his family moved to this suburban town in Ohio, and Kieran had managed to avoid most social interactions. He preferred it that way. The constant relocating due to his father's military career had taught him that forming attachments was pointless when you never stayed anywhere long enough for them to matter. What nobody at Roosevelt High knew was that those years of moving had also led him to martial arts dojos across the country, where he'd found solace in the discipline and structure that his chaotic home life lacked. By age 16, Kieran had earned a black belt in Taekwondo and had been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 3 years. His instructors consistently praised his natural talent and dedication, but Kieran kept this completely separate from school. He'd learned early that revealing any kind of strength or skill only painted a bigger target on your back when you were perpetually the new kid. Roosevelt High School sat on 40 acres of manicured grounds, its red brick buildings connected by covered walkways that buzzed with student activity between classes. The school prided itself on its championship football team and academic achievements, but like most large institutions, it had its share of predators who thrived on teenage hierarchy. Braxton Mills ruled the junior class with the confidence that came from being the star quarterback's younger brother and possessing the kind of natural charisma that made teachers look the other way when trouble started. Standing 6'2", with the build of someone who spent every free moment in the weight room, Braxton had sandy blonde hair and blue eyes that could shift from charming to menacing in an instant. His two constant companions, Wade Patterson and Tanner Reeves, followed his lead without question. Wade was stocky and aggressive, always ready to prove himself, while Tanner was tall and lanky, with a cruel sense of humor that made him laugh at others' pain. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in the main hallway near the trophy cases. Kieran was walking to his locker, head down, focusing on the pattern of scuff marks on the linoleum floor, when someone deliberately bumped into him hard enough to send his books scattering. "Watch where you're going, new kid," Braxton said, his voice carrying that particular tone that was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A few students slowed their pace to watch, but none stopped. Kieran bent to collect his scattered materials, his jaw clenched, but his movements controlled. "Sorry," he mumbled, though they both knew he hadn't been at fault. "Damn right you're sorry," Wade chimed in, stepping on one of Kieran's notebooks as he tried to pick it up. "Maybe next time you'll pay attention." The laughter that followed them down the hall burned in Kieran's ears, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. The way Master Chen had taught him back in California, violence was always the last resort, and these were just words and minor provocations. The pattern established itself quickly over the following days. Braxton and his crew would find small ways to make Kieran's day miserable, knocking books from his hands, making comments about his clothes or his quiet demeanor, ensuring he felt like an outsider. The incidents were always just minor enough that no teacher would consider them worth addressing, but persistent enough to create constant tension. It was during lunch in the cafeteria when Kieran first noticed Dakota Summers. She sat alone at a corner table, reading a worn paperback novel while picking at a salad. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a vintage band t-shirt that immediately told Kieran she wasn't interested in fitting in with the popular crowd. When she looked up and caught him staring, she offered a small smile that made his stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with the terrible cafeteria food. Their first conversation happened by accident when they both reached for the same book in the library. The Outsiders, Dakota said, glancing at the title. Good choice. Though I'd recommend Hinton's That Was Then, This Is Now, if you haven't read it. Kieran found himself actually speaking to another person for the first time in weeks. I haven't. Is it similar? Same themes, but darker, more about how people change and grow apart. She paused, studying his face. You're the new guy, right? Kieran. The fact that she knew his name surprised him. Yeah, and you're Dakota. Word travels fast in a school this size, she said with a grin. Especially when someone manages to stay invisible for 3 weeks straight. That takes talent. Their friendship developed slowly, built on shared lunch periods in the library and quiet conversations about books, music, and the peculiar social ecosystem of high school. Dakota had been at Roosevelt since kindergarten, but had never quite found her place among the established cliques. She was too smart for the party crowd, too alternative for the academics, and too genuine for the social climbers. Kieran found himself looking forward to school for the first time since arriving, though he was careful to keep his growing feelings for Dakota to himself. She represented something he'd never allowed himself to want, a real connection with someone who saw past his carefully constructed walls. The bullying continued, but Kieran endured it with the patience he'd learned through years of meditation and training. Braxton seemed to view him as entertainment, a stress ball to squeeze whenever he needed to feel powerful. The incidents escalated slowly. Shoulder checks in the hallway became harder, comments became more personal, and the audience of bystanders grew larger as word spread that the new kid was an easy target. "Why don't you ever fight back?" Dakota asked one afternoon as they sat on the bleachers after school. She'd witnessed Wade accidentally spill chocolate milk on Kieran's shirt during lunch, and the frustration in her voice was evident. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, watching the football team practice on the field below. "Sometimes fighting back just makes things worse," he said finally. "My dad always said the strongest person in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it." What he didn't tell her was that he'd seen what happened when trained fighters lost control. During his second year of jiu-jitsu training in Texas, he'd watched a senior student seriously injure someone during a street altercation. The legal consequences, the guilt, the way it changed him. Kieran had sworn never to let his training become a weapon unless someone's life was genuinely at risk. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October. Kieran was walking through the main hallway with Dakota, both of them discussing plans to see a movie that weekend, when Braxton and his crew materialized as if they'd been lying in wait. "Well, look what we have here," Braxton said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. The invisible man finally found himself a girlfriend. Dakota's hand tightened on her books, but she kept walking. Kieran could feel the familiar knot forming in his stomach, but he forced himself to maintain their pace toward the exit. "I'm talking to you, ghost boy," Braxton called out, his voice echoing off the lockers. "Don't be rude." When Kieran continued walking, Wade moved to block their path, while Tanner circled around behind them. The hallway was crowded with students heading home for the weekend, but the crowd seemed to part automatically, creating a circle of space around the confrontation. "Leave us alone, Braxton," Dakota said, her voice steady but tense. "Oh, the little bookworm has opinions," Braxton laughed, and Kieran caught the dangerous glint in his eyes. "Tell me, Dakota, what do you see in this loser? Is it the way he runs away from every confrontation? Real attractive quality in a guy? Better than compensating for insecurity by picking on people who won't fight back," Dakota shot back, and Kieran wished desperately that she hadn't said it. Braxton's expression darkened. Insecurity. That's rich, coming from someone who's been nobody since elementary school. He stepped closer to Kieran, close enough that Kieran could smell the protein shake on his breath. "You know what, Ghost Boy? I think it's time everyone saw what kind of man you really are." Before Kieran could react, Braxton grabbed the front of his navy jacket and yanked hard. The worn fabric, already weakened by years of wear, tore with a loud ripping sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet hallway. The force of the pull sent Kieran stumbling backward, and he heard Dakota gasp as the jacket split completely down the front seam. "Oops," Braxton said with exaggerated innocence, still holding the torn fabric. "Looks like your boyfriend's outfit is as weak as he is, Dakota." The laughter that erupted from the growing crowd of onlookers felt like physical blows. Kieran stood there in his thin white t-shirt, the ruined jacket hanging in tatters, feeling more exposed and humiliated than he ever had in his life. That jacket had been his armor, his shield against the world, and now it was destroyed in front of half the school. But it was the look on Dakota's face that finally broke something inside him. She wasn't laughing or embarrassed, she was furious, her cheeks flushed with anger on his behalf, and seeing her caught up in his humiliation was more than he could bear. "That jacket belonged to my brother," Kieran said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that made several students stop laughing. "What was that, ghost boy?" Braxton taunted, tossing the torn fabric at Kieran's feet. "Speak up so everyone can hear you." Kieran looked down at the ruined jacket, then back up at Braxton. Something fundamental had shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening of his spine that made him appear taller despite his unchanged height. "I said that jacket belonged to my brother who's currently deployed in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne." The change in Kieran was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared, his hands hung loose at his sides, and his breathing became deep and controlled. Dakota noticed it first, the way his entire bearing transformed from defensive to ready. "So what?" Wade laughed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your brother's not here to protect you." "No," Kieran agreed, his voice calm and measured. "He's not." Over the weekend, word of the jacket incident spread through the school's social media networks like wildfire. Videos taken on cell phones showed Braxton's triumphant laughter and Kieran's humiliation, and by Monday morning, it seemed like everyone at Roosevelt High had seen it. Kieran endured the pointing and whispered comments with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all semester, but those who looked closely might have noticed subtle changes. He moved through the hallways with a different energy, his steps more deliberate, his awareness heightened. During lunch, instead of sitting quietly while Dakota read, he asked her about her martial arts interests, mentioning almost casually that he'd trained in several different disciplines during his family's moves. "Really?" Dakota asked, looking up from her book with genuine interest. "What kind of training?" "Taekwondo, mainly. Some jiu-jitsu." He shrugged as if it were no big deal. "Moving around a lot, it was something consistent I could do anywhere." Dakota studied his face, noting the way his eyes seemed more alert, more focused than she'd ever seen them. Are you good at it?" Kieran was quiet for a moment. "Good enough." That afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, noticed Kieran's improved posture during class. "Senor Thorne," she said after the bell rang, "you seem different today, more confident." "Just having a good day," Kieran replied with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The truth was that Kieran had spent the weekend processing what had happened, working through his emotions with the mental discipline his martial arts training had instilled. The humiliation had been a catalyst, stripping away the last of his reluctance to defend himself. He wasn't seeking revenge, but he was no longer willing to be anyone's victim. Braxton, meanwhile, was riding high on his latest victory. The destruction of Kieran's jacket had cemented his reputation as someone who could humiliate the weak without consequence, and he basked in the admiration of his followers and the fear of potential targets. "Did you see that kid's face?" Wade laughed during their lunch period. "I thought he was going to cry right there in the hallway." "Best part was watching his little girlfriend realize what a loser she's been hanging out with, Tanner added. Braxton leaned back in his chair, surveying the cafeteria like a king. I'm thinking we need to plan something special for this week. Can't let Ghost Boy think that was the end of it. The opportunity came Tuesday afternoon, during the passing period between 5th and 6th periods. The hallway near the gymnasium was always crowded, creating perfect cover for what Braxton had planned. He'd recruited several football players to help create a more dramatic scene, and they positioned themselves strategically throughout the corridor. Kieran was walking to his chemistry class, alone this time, since Dakota had a different schedule 6th period, when he found his path blocked by the familiar trio. Well, well, Braxton announced loudly enough for the entire hallway to hear. Look who decided to show his face again. How's that jacket situation working out for you, Ghost Boy? The crowd began to form immediately, students slowing their pace and pulling out phones to record whatever was about to happen. Kieran stopped walking but didn't retreat, his dark eyes meeting Braxton's with a steady gaze that hadn't been there before. I asked you a question, Braxton continued, stepping closer. Or are you too scared to answer? Maybe we need to help you find your voice again. This time, Wade didn't wait for a signal. He moved behind Kieran while Tanner approached from the side, attempting to recreate the positioning that had worked so well during the jacket incident. But when Wade reached out to grab Kieran's shoulder, something unexpected happened. Kieran's hand moved with lightning speed, catching Wade's wrist in a grip that made the larger boy yelp in pain and surprise. The movement was so fast and controlled that several students gasped audibly. "Don't touch me," Kieran said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmur of the crowd. Wade tried to pull his wrist free, but Kieran's grip was like iron. The smaller boy applied just enough pressure to make his point without causing permanent damage, then released Wade's arm with a controlled motion that left no doubt about who had been in control of the exchange. Braxton's eyes widened slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of so many witnesses. So the Ghost Boy has some fight in him after all, he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Let's see how tough you really are. As Braxton moved forward, Kieran shifted into a stance that anyone with martial arts knowledge would have recognized immediately. His feet positioned shoulder-width apart, his weight evenly distributed, his hands relaxed but ready. The transformation from invisible victim to trained fighter was so complete that it seemed like a different person entirely. I don't want to fight you, Braxton, Kieran said, his voice calm and measured. Walk away. The hallway had gone completely silent. Even the background noise of lockers slamming and distant conversations seemed to fade as everyone present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The quiet kid, the easy target, the boy who had endured weeks of humiliation without resistance, was standing his ground. Braxton's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He couldn't back down now, not with half the school watching and recording. You think you scare me? He shouted, lunging forward with a wild swing aimed at Kieran's head. What happened next would be replayed on social media for weeks afterward. Kieran moved with fluid precision, stepping aside from Braxton's clumsy attack and using the larger boy's momentum against him. A simple foot sweep sent Braxton crashing to the floor, his athletic coordination useless against technique he'd never encountered. Tanner rushed in to help his fallen leader, but Kieran was ready. Years of training had taught him to track multiple opponents, and he caught Tanner's charge with a perfectly timed hip toss that sent the tall boy sprawling next to Braxton. The entire sequence took less than 10 seconds, and when it was over, both bullies were on the ground while Kieran stood over them, barely breathing hard. Wade, clutching his sore wrist, took one look at his defeated friends and decided discretion was the better part of valor. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Kieran's calm expression. How? Braxton gasped from the floor, staring up at the boy he'd tormented for weeks. How did you? I tried to avoid this, Kieran said, extending his hand to help Braxton to his feet. The gesture surprised everyone present, including Braxton himself. But I won't be anyone's victim anymore. Braxton hesitated for a moment, then accepted the offered hand and allowed Kieran to pull him upright. The symbolic nature of the gesture wasn't lost on the watching crowd, the victor showing mercy to the defeated. "This isn't over," Braxton muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Everyone present had seen how easily Kieran had handled both him and Tanner, and the social hierarchy of Roosevelt High had just experienced a seismic shift. "Yes," Kieran said quietly, his dark eyes meeting Braxton's with absolute certainty, "it is." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and disbelief, Dakota appeared at Kieran's side. She'd missed the actual confrontation, but had arrived in time to see Braxton accepting help from the boy he'd spent weeks tormenting. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern and something else, a new awareness of who Kieran really was beneath his quiet exterior. "I'm fine," Kieran replied, and for the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, he truly meant it. The weight of constantly looking over his shoulder, of enduring daily humiliation, had been lifted from his shoulders. He was still the same person he'd always been, but now everyone else could see it too. The aftermath of the hallway confrontation rippled through Roosevelt High like shockwaves from an earthquake. By the end of the day, cell phone videos of the incident had been shared hundreds of times, and the story grew more dramatic with each retelling. The quiet new kid who had endured weeks of bullying had revealed himself to be a trained fighter, but more importantly, he'd shown mercy when he could have chosen revenge. Principal Hawkins called all 4 boys to his office the following morning, but the investigation was complicated by the fact that dozens of witnesses confirmed Kieran had acted purely in self-defense. Braxton and Tanner received 3 days of in-school suspension for starting the fight, while Kieran received only a warning about the school's zero-tolerance policy. "I understand you were defending yourself," Principal Hawkins said during their private conversation, "but I need to know, is this going to be an ongoing problem?" Kieran shook his head. "I don't think so, sir. I think everything's been settled." The changes in school dynamics were immediately apparent. Students who had previously ignored Kieran began nodding respectfully when they passed him in the halls. The football players who had positioned themselves to witness Braxton's planned humiliation now kept their distance, having seen what happened when someone underestimated the quiet new kid. Most significantly, Braxton himself seemed to have undergone a transformation. The swagger was gone, replaced by a more subdued demeanor that suggested he was finally questioning his own behavior. He no longer traveled with his usual entourage, and when he encountered Kieran in the hallways, he would nod slightly, not friendly, but acknowledging a grudging respect. Dakota found herself seeing Kieran in an entirely new light. The gentle, book-loving boy she'd befriended was still there, but now she understood there were depths to him she'd never suspected. Their friendship deepened as they spent long afternoons talking about everything from literature to philosophy to the strange social dynamics that govern teenage life. "Why didn't you tell me about your training?" she asked one evening as they sat in the school parking lot after a basketball game. Kieran was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the crowd file out of the gymnasium. "Because I never wanted to be defined by what I could do to other people," he said finally. "I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I'm capable of when pushed too far. And now? Now I realize that sometimes you have to show strength before people will see your other qualities." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "I don't regret what happened, but I hope it never has to happen again." 2 weeks after the confrontation, an unexpected conversation took place near the trophy cases where Kieran's ordeal had first begun. Braxton approached him alone, without his usual backup, his expression uncertain but determined. "Thorne," he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Kieran stopped walking and turned to face his former tormentor. "What's on your mind?" Braxton looked uncomfortable, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone accustomed to using intimidation rather than communication. "I wanted to... what I did to you with the jacket and everything." He trailed off, then forced himself to continue. "It was wrong. I was being a complete ass, and you didn't deserve any of it." The apology hung in the air between them, surprising in its sincerity. Kieran studied Braxton's face, seeing something he'd never noticed before: uncertainty, vulnerability, maybe even genuine remorse. "Why?" Kieran asked simply. "Why did you target me in the first place?" Braxton was quiet for a long moment, staring at the trophy cases filled with achievements he'd always assumed would define his worth. "Because I could," he admitted finally. "Because you were new and quiet, and you didn't fight back. It made me feel powerful, I guess, like I was important. And now? Now I realize that making someone else feel small doesn't actually make you any bigger." Braxton met Kieran's eyes directly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me or be my friend or anything like that. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, and it won't happen again." Kieran nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," he said. "And for what it's worth, I think you're better than the person you were pretending to be." As they parted ways, both boys understood that something fundamental had shifted, not just between them, but in their understanding of themselves. Braxton walked away with a new awareness of the impact his actions had on others, while Kieran felt the final piece of his transformation click into place. The story of what happened in the hallway at Roosevelt High became legend, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. But for those who lived it, the real lesson wasn't about the dramatic confrontation or the martial arts skills that turned the tables on bullies. It was about the quiet courage it takes to remain true to yourself while refusing to be anyone's victim, and the understanding that real strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use the power you possess. Kieran Thorne had learned to be visible without losing himself, to stand up without becoming what he'd once feared. And in the halls of Roosevelt High, where social hierarchies had once seemed carved in stone, everyone had learned that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should never underestimate.